So we've all been there. You're out shopping, maybe on your local high street or maybe somewhere new and unfamiliar. You're going happily about your afternoon, picking up some groceries or trying to find a new pair of shoes when nature calls. And as the need to go increases, so does a sense of panic as you realise you have no idea where to find the nearest toilet. Maybe you have a go-to spot, a familiar cafe or pub, or you spot somewhere more anonymous, like a fast food outlet where you can sneak in unnoticed. Or, if you're lucky, maybe there's a library, gallery, or museum open nearby with toilets for visitors. Perhaps you brave the public toilets, fearing wet floors, broken loo seats, and no toilet roll, or attempt to use them only to find them locked or out of order. Maybe you have no choice but to abandon your shopping trip and hope you can dash home in time. Providing somewhere to go to the toilet is not only a matter of public and social responsibility, but it is also one that makes business sense. Without toilets, people are limited to the amount of time they can spend on high streets. So, what can design contribute? How can designers create toilets that are truly accessible, but also sustainable and fantastic places to visit? This question is one of the many that are preoccupying Professor Jo-Anne Bichard and Gail Ramster here at the Royal College of Art, where they lead the Public Toilet Research Unit. I'm your host, Benji Jeffrey, and you're listening to the Royal College of Art podcast. The Royal College of Art is the world's #1 art and design university and home to the next generation of creatives. It represents the largest concentration of postgraduate artists and designers on the planet, and on this podcast, we're taking a deep dive into what we do here. We're talking to staff, students, and the wider RCA community about how their work affects the world at large. And in today's episode, we're talking toilets. Jo-Anne and Gail are part of the RCA's Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design, which is a research centre here at the college, which for over 30 years has been looking at ways that design can be used to solve challenges in areas such as healthcare, age, and diversity. Jo-Anne is a professor of accessible design and a design anthropologist whose research involves collaboration across disciplines and actively including others in the design process. Gail is a senior research associate at the centre, and her research addresses social challenges through participatory and co-design methods with citizens and communities. In our conversation, we discussed ways that designers of all disciplines, from service design to experience design, can contribute to making toilets more accessible. They shared some of their experiences of how human-centred design can help foster mutual understanding and make toilets better for everyone. And we look to the future of the toilet, or Loo-topia, as they like to call it. Jo-Anne and Gail, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Benji.
How are you both doing?
Very well.
Yeah, we're good.
We're good. Yeah.
Good. So let's get straight into the important stuff. Why are toilets so important to you both?
Well, it's the one, from a design perspective, it's the one space in the built environment that practically everybody is going to use at some point during the day and night. And so it's really important that we get them as inclusive as possible. And that inclusion thinks about age and ability and gender and social economic circumstances. We're trying to think about every issue that people might face as a barrier to accessing toilets. From a personal perspective, it's toilets. Everybody has a toilet story.
Yeah.
And those stories are sometimes really funny, but always illuminating. Sometimes they're really sad and, again, equally illuminating.
What about you, Gail? How did you land on toilets?
So I have an engineering background and then came into design doing what was then called industrial design engineering at the Royal College of Art. And I think with that design background, I find toilets so interesting because there's so little design there. They're kind of massively neglected by designers, by politicians and policymakers. Like in the most basic terms, just getting in the cubicle can be quite difficult. And then there's the ergonomics of it, of like pulling your shoulder, trying to reach the toilet paper. But then it just kind of proliferates into communication design and wayfinding and service design, like the order in which you go through the steps to use a public toilet, how it then fits into the built environment and accessibility and how we move around our cities and our lives. So we just find endless ways to look at and to research design through this lens of the public toilet.
Yeah, it's like a petri dish for all kinds of inclusivity. every aspect, as Gail said. You get into product design, you get into architectural and space design, you get into service design. And if one element of those features fails, the toilet will fail. So, you can have a toilet paper dispenser that can't be actually used by everybody due to hand problems and reach problems and other ergonomic issues. But then if there's no toilet paper in the toilet paper dispenser, then that's a major service design failure in some ways. So it's kind of a very sort of narrow perspective, but it can be so widely applied to all areas of inclusivity and inclusive design. One of the most things that kind of makes me laugh, makes me smile, is that when people come and sit by us in our research studio, we tell them, look, we've got to warn you now, all we talk about is toilets. And they're like, oh, yeah, you must talk about other things, life, this, that and the other. And it's like, no, we don't. All we talk about is toilets. And people do come and sit with us and they're working with us for a few months and like, it's true. All you talk about is toilets. We talk about them constantly. We find, a news item comes up and we'll be sharing it with each other. We'll see a toilet angle to it. We'll go into long conversations about locks, about doors, about this, about every aspect, and getting into the politics, the policy, what's bad, what's good, where we've seen, I saw a really great toilet the other day. I saw a really bad toilet the other day. This all helps to feed into what we are considering good design of toilets and bad design of toilets, and how we're going to try and not replicate or maybe use that as a lesson to take forward.
It is also a really useful way to explain my job to people, like parents on the school run. I can start talking about inclusive design and social challenges and they glaze over and have no idea what I'm talking about. And I say, for example, most of my research is about public toilets, and then they instantly think I'm a bit weird, but then, as Jo-Anne said before, they have their own toilet experiences because everybody does. So they'll start either talking about a great toilet that they once saw, or this awful toilet that they went to last time, or quite often they start opening up and talking about their own personal experiences because they have irritable bowel syndrome or older parents that they need to look after, and say actually they don't leave the house unless they know that there's somewhere that they know that they can use. So it becomes this, it's a great subject matter to be able to sort of do inclusive design ad hoc, just constantly learning more and more experiences and angles to it.
And it's also, I think, as creatives, quite often it's quite difficult when someone asks you what you do to kind of boil it down, to have something that's just one word. And also that something that has a lot of baggage, right? As something to do with accessibility, there's quite a kind of serious side to it, but at the same time, it's also hilarious, right? Toilets are very funny things, like toilet humour is a big thing.
Yeah. It's very much embedded within our culture. In British culture about toilets, and, we have certain historical pride that we were one of the first cities to, especially in London, to have public toilets. And in the UK, we used to have a really huge public toilet map, of toilets in every city. It was a marvel of Victorian philanthropy that every town would have a toilet, and now, when sometimes people complain about toilets, we once led the way in this, and now, where are we? Because we are losing them at an alarming rate. Right. And we are both passionate about the fact that there does need to be more toilets, but also we've got to find new ways of providing that service, because for many local authorities, they're faced with such serious budget constraints that sometimes, reluctantly, they have no option but to close the toilets, because, they're quite expensive to maintain, especially when you think of some of the other activities that take place in toilets, especially vandalism. There's a big problem with vandalism at the moment. And so building robust public toilets that is able to withstand a little bit of frustration is also really important. But it's also really important to make those toilets accessible. So you're bringing this sort of like designing out crime element into with inclusive design and making sure that one doesn't cancel out the other, because in most toilets that have been built and designed from a resistance perspective to withstand some of these activities, the inclusion, the accessibility has just been designed right out.
Right, because I guess in London, a lot of the public toilets were underground to a certain extent, right? So not accessible for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's gone through different cycles of replacing the underground toilets with automatic public toilets, which were then street level and much more accessible because they could be used by wheelchair users and have baby changing, everything built in, and they were self-cleaning. But then that didn't work because there just weren't a very good design, that people don't want to use an automatic toilet where you need to, as someone Jo-Anne spoke to said, like, you don't want to have to read the instructions on how to use a toilet, and you don't want the door to open on the street if you get it wrong. So then those are taken away, and then you end up with, well, now we haven't got anything. But as you said before, that we have this culture of finding toilets very amusing. Like, it's got two sides to it, because we are starting to use that a bit to have better puns in our work. I was always very uptight about it because it's a serious issue, you know, this is affecting people. It's really needs to be taken seriously and not made jokes about. But actually, it's quite fun. So now we have a website called Tinkle, which is the Toilets Innovation and New Knowledge Exchange, where we have all the resources that either we've made or other researchers or organisations have made about UK toilet design. And in our last project, which was called Engaged, one of our researchers said that it's as if we're trying to create Loo-topia on the high street, like perfect public toilets. Now we really want a project called Loo-topia.
Amazing.
But I do feel that this taboo that exists alongside that of, like, we can joke about toilets, but we can't raise them in a meeting. We can't, like, we're too embarrassed to actually talk about toilets, is a real problem for the UK in getting a better quality of public toilets. Because whenever I'm looking at government documents, inclusive design guidance, information, 50 ways on how to improve your high street, there were dozens of these reports out there, and they don't mention toilets. And it's so obvious once you start thinking about it. But instead they'll talk about the hanging baskets and the free parking and the benches, or they'll talk about accessible facilities in, like, quotation marks, but they won't specifically say you need to have a toilet, else people can't spend more than half an hour on your high street.
Yeah.
But if you don't mention it, then the designers aren't going to catch on, or they're going to think they're being a bit weird by bringing it up in a meeting. Like, it doesn't help facilitate a conversation, and it doesn't sort of bring it to the table. So fighting that side of the British toilet humour is quite a big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, there was a cycling, Gail's a very keen cyclist, and there was a new cycling policy document that came out, and we sort of like, oh, this is interesting. We went through it and we did the word search, and of course, nothing about toilets. And cyclists need toilets. Their journeys might be slightly shorter or slightly longer than the average car driver or even van driver, but they still need toilets on the journey. And people, pedestrians, obviously, if people decide to walk from one station to another station and avoid public transport or something, at some point along the way, they might need a toilet. And often people are sort of really reluctant to go into a business where they don't have to buy something to use the toilets. There's this, it's almost like this, we kind of sort of infantile people by sort of like, getting them to sort of, can I use your toilet, please? We shouldn't have to ask to use the toilet. So there's been lots of initiatives, some of which have worked, some of which haven't worked, to open up sort of private space, shops and cafes and everything, to let non-customers use their toilets. But I think we're still somewhat nervous about going into that private space where we don't feel that we have an automatic right of access to a toilet and actually using it. And obviously with that, the owner of the business always has the right to refuse. And that's their right, it's their business. So it doesn't mean that everybody can actually have access to toilets. And that's why public toilets are still really important.
And there's two different strands going on there in what you're talking about, right? There's the design element, which is designing the correct toilet, and then the kind of cultural policy side of things. Do you engage in the policy side of things as well as the design side of things?
Yeah, because I think the policy side of it sort of reflects the systemic design, like the barriers that stop more toilets and better toilets from being built in the first place. There's no policy that says councils have to provide toilets. And so there's no money to support councils in providing toilets. And if they're haven't got any money to build them or to refurbish them, then how are we going to help them to make them more inclusive? So just finding out where the toilets are is a big problem, which is why we made the Great British Public Toilet Map, which is a UK-wide database of all the publicly accessible toilets that we know of in the country. So public toilets, but also ones in train stations and shopping centres and anywhere that the public does have a sort of right of access. So there's 14,000 of those. That was one problem of just knowing where the toilets are that already exist. And then once we know, we can also try to share the design guidance that we have in how to make toilets more inclusive. So we've done some consultancy work there to, try to get the best standard of toilet built. But it's definitely a very broad subject, and we do like to tackle all sides to it.
And you touched on Tinkle earlier as well.
Oh, yes,
Can you tell us a
yes.
bit more about Tinkle?
So Tinkle is a website where we have pulled together all the UK design guidance around toilets. We also have a list of design of toilet experts and a blog element to it that we call latrinalia, which is the term used for toilet graffiti. But we're using it for a kind of online peer-to-peer community. So yes, toilets are quite a niche subject. But as Joanne was saying before with the cycling, like they affect so many different aspects to life, like commuting and cycling and accessing nature and tourism and public health. So they don't fit within any one person's job description or department. So they do fall between the cracks. No pun intended. So, it gets overlooked a lot. And that happens again with the guidance that is out there. There's British standards about public toilets that people don't know or find out about, and Joanne's on that standards committee, so it's a brilliant standard, but if people don't know that it exists, then they don't know that they could be following it. Network Rail recently wrote a massive document about the inclusive design of toilets in their stations, and they've done a lot of work refurbishing all of their toilets and removing the charges, even though they're making a fortune out of charging people 50p to use the toilet. And they're now building toilets to a really high standard with a massive document to go with it. So all of these things exist and we know about them, but we don't know that if other people know about them. So if you pull it all into one place, we can help particularly designers and architects to find out the best standards for building toilets.
And is that what Tinkle is?
So that's what Tinkle is.
Brilliant. With all these kind of like possibilities for how things can be changed, do you perceive that there is any sort of limit to the capacity for inclusivity within this?
Well, once upon a time, I mean, it wasn't that long ago, maybe 15 years ago, when we first started doing the research, there were people with profound and multiple disabilities. They weren't really catered for by the accessible toilet. And there was a group in Scotland called PAMIS who put together and designed what they called a changing places toilet that included an adult changing bed in it and much larger space. And, initially that was quite niche. But now, recently, the government put, I think it was 30 million, wasn't it? 30 million funding in place for, changing places toilets to be built everywhere. And they actually have their own separate map, although we do include them on the Great British Public Toilet Map. And they now should be found, a changing places toilet should be found in, basically every city. Lots of museums are building them. And they're becoming a more common feature of toilet provision in the UK. And I believe, that's something that we can say once again in our toilet pride of a country, that we are leading the way in, that we're providing, some very, very important pieces of toilet infrastructure for those who are very, very very, very disabled and need extra care, extra space, more people to help them within the toilet provision. But there's also other aspects. So we're thinking about things like neurodiversity and areas such as that. These are pretty new areas to think about in terms of design for the built environment. Our colleague, Dr. Katie Gaudian, she's doing a lot of work in that area, and we do hope that we can join up with her soon. And she's just finished some work on streetscapes, and we're hoping that we might be able to turn that into a more sort of active toilet research project that looks at what are the needs of our neurodiverse population when it comes to toilets. I mean, I know from my previous research that a lot of people with neurodiversity found the blue lights that were very common about 10 years ago, which were a design out crime intervention to stop intravenous drug use in toilets. But this blue light actually made the toilet environment very unwelcoming for people with visual impairments, for older people who found it just very overwhelming, and especially for people with autism and who were neurodiverse, who also found it a very, very alien space to be inside. So looking more at that area, those are sort of new areas that need more thought and attention, I think.
Yeah, certainly. Hand dryers is another one that comes up a lot, that children with autism can be very kind of distressed by the noise that comes from the hand dryers, particularly the newer ones. So there's elements to the physical product design that can be improved with more awareness of neurodiversity. Katie and I have also been talking about other aspects of the toilet, such as the fuller sensory experience of the toilet. There's lots of different smells going on, but there's also ways to mask smells, and that those themselves can be overwhelming. So it's sort of figuring out what the balance is of what would be, there is almost never a one-size-fits-all solution, but increasing the awareness of different people's needs before making these decisions. And then there's also kind of a social aspect to toilets, in that, as Jo-Anne said earlier, everybody needs to use the toilet, and there'll be complete strangers with very different needs and very different preferences using the toilet at the same time. It's an area where all different parts of society come together and maybe don't appreciate or aren't empathic to each other's experiences. So is it a setting for where the experiences of people with different disabilities or people with neurodiversities could be elevated and shared, so that kind of mutual understanding is enhanced?
Yeah, and do you think that is possible to be? It seems so like utopian, right? To have this magical space. Sorry, Loo-topian. To have this magical space that is able to cater to everyone. Can you see that happening? Yes.
Maybe.
I mean, not quickly. It's possible, but
I think design has all the possibilities. I don't think we've got all the answers yet. And good design research and that will help good design can make these things possible. I mean, what could the future toilet be? Possibly a self-contained cubicle that you somehow set the ambience to, that you control the ventilation in some way, shape or form. I remember some researchers from the Netherlands designed this toilet that would come with an access card, and all your preferences would be on this card, and you'd swipe it in like you would your Oyster card. And the toilet would reconfigure itself to how you needed it. And it was brilliant. But the reality of it is that no one's going to pay for that. That's a very, very expensive high-tech toilet to actually produce. So how can we take things that we learn from that research, and sort of like make it more static, or what learnings are there? I mean, it could be that as technology becomes more prevalent, that things can be made that are a lot cheaper or a lot more sustainable or a lot easier to maintain and service and clean, because that's the other element of the toilet. We can all go in there and use it, but someone's got to come in and clean it after us. And we really want that sort of we want to know that our environment that we're going to get down and dirty in, pardon the pun, is going to be clean. And the next user, won't be able to sort of sense that we've already been in there. It's an incredibly private act in public. So what kind of technologies do cleaners need? And these are the other people that we try to involve in our toilet sort of research to find out what works for them. Now, there are some aspects of toilet design that works better for them but doesn't really work for users. So, what's the balance? It is finding a balance between every possible person that's going to be in there, and then doing it in a cost-effective way.
And you touched on sustainability there as well. What are the concerns with sustainability in this? Because surely as well, this inclusive toilet, does it become less sustainable by needing cleaning more often and needing more facilities in it? Or we're talking this utopian toilet.
It's difficult. I mean, there's been lots of technologies that have been introduced into toilets that have and have not worked. So some have tried to use grey water for flushing. Some have tried to use the short flush and the long flush, which I personally don't believe works in public because people want to get rid of their waste. Nobody wants to see evidence of it. I went to Japan once, and for the Kyoto Agreement way back when, they built a fantastic sustainable toilet. It was grey watered, and it was, light censored, so the lights only came on when the user was in there. And they had even produced a water recycling sort of aspect to the flushing as well. But what they couldn't do was get the water clear. So the water was yellow, even though it was clean water. And, you walked in and you just saw this yellow water. And, of course, your immediate thought was that somebody had used it. Uh-huh. And that, so the sense of a stranger having been there before you and hadn't flushed, all these thoughts going, oh, that person is da-da-da-da-da, it just feels icky. So, but they the designers assured me that, that's just it. We just cannot get the yellow out of the water. Mm. So I found that really interesting, because then we're getting into this sort of personal, cultural sort of element that's sort of mixing with the desire to be more sustainable and use our resources more wisely. But in some ways, we're just not there yet. Sometimes we've got a little bit more to go to actually sort of sort these things out, which are, sort of personal, social and cultural phobias that we experience in the toilet. We don't experience them at home. Mm. But the minute, what goes on in our own homes, we've got a very, very relaxed sort of attitude towards. But when we get into public space, we've got this layer of publicness that comes onto us, and there's a whole different criteria that we have to engage with when we walk into the toilet cubicle.
Mm. With far different, that's what I find interesting, that there are these cultural elements to it that stop people from changing their behaviour, even if it's a better design. Like, there are some places in the city now, but much more in the countryside, where you'll have composting toilets, and that composted waste can then be reused. There's one in an allotment in East London. So that can proliferate, and as people get more experiences of using things like that, then they'll be less confused by it the next time. Mm. Like, another area where there's social and cultural norms is the idea that we need separate genders of toilets, and that giving up these separate genders of toilets is somehow against British culture or something. Like, this is sort of an arbitrary distinction, that we should have men's and females toilets rather than just having private toilets where it doesn't really matter who else is in the space, because we've got our own cubicle to do whatever it is that we need to do. Mm. And there are lots of reasons why people might want more privacy than the standard cubicle, toilet cubicle design offers them. So we kind of, trying to encourage the best possible, most inclusive toilet design. There's lots of barriers in the way, and sometimes it's the sort of practical maintenance engineer barriers of, this is how we've always made them, and this is the cheapest way to do it, so why should we do it any differently? But sometimes it's much more cultural or social, which makes it interesting for us.
I mean, one of the things that Gail and I did, we did a consultation for a museum in London, and they were building fully enclosed cubicles, and they wanted them to be gender neutral. And we took a cue from the Alzheimer's Society, who, in the signage for the toilets, that instead of putting a figure of the user on the toilet, which automatically reminds the user who has the right of access, we just put a toilet on the door, just a picture of the WC pan. At the end of the day, it's a toilet. Yeah. That's what it is. That's what it's there for. And as far as we're aware, they've gone down very, very well. And actually, we also recommended that to the RCA when they were building the research tower, which we now sit in, and they've done the same here. And we have received comments from visitors saying we like the signage for the toilets, because at the end of the day, it's a fully enclosed cubicle. It's once you get in it, it's yours. It's your cubicle, and it's a toilet. And you're doing what you're doing in there, and then you leave, and the next user comes in. And it becomes their cubicle after you. And there seems to be, some of the issues that arise from this, because it's about privacy. At the end of the day, what people want when they use the toilet is privacy. And so we feel that just having the sign of a toilet logo kind of takes away some of those other issues that sometimes make our life very interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of examples, aren't there, where that doesn't happen for practical reasons that we forget, like festivals, for example, right? It's very rare that you have a gendered door on a festival.
Yeah.
But also I was going to say, you always remember a good toilet as well.
Yeah.
Like the British summertime thing in Hyde Park that happened this year. The toilets were phenomenal.
Oh, I missed that.
They were like space age toilets, like
Wonderful.
rather than your kind of standard kind of blue dingy. Beautiful lighting, great for selfies. You know?
Yeah.
Became a really exciting place to be.
Yeah. And that, I mean, this is something that I think more and more people who are into experience design realise that, you know, if you're designing for humans to be somewhere for more than maybe 3 or 4 hours, or maybe more, even more than 2 hours, you're going to have to think about somewhere for them to go. And, you know, if you build that, the toilet, into the experience, then, you know, people are going to remember that toilet. Remember, we all have good toilet stories.
Yeah.
And we all have bad toilet stories. So, you know, having a really good toilet that people are going, oh, yeah, you know, we went to that, it was a great festival, but the toilets were bloody brilliant. They were so much fun. They were this or they were that, you know. It really helps embed that memory and that creation of memory, and people will come back. And it's the same for any kind of business. If you spend time and attention on making your toilets interesting and accessible, they have to be accessible, you know, people will come back. They will remember your toilets. My mum once took me to this place in Spain. My mum lives in Spain. And she took me to this town, Murcia, and she said, we have to go to this casino. And in Murcia, the casino is like the working men's club. And she said, we have to go there because the toilets are just fantastic. And they were. They were the women's toilets. It was like an art gallery. There was frescoes on the roof and curtains. It was beautiful. And, you know, it's like, it stays in people's memories, and then people actually want to take people to that. Now, there are 2 countries that have actually sort of capitalised on this fact, New Zealand and Japan, who have actually built some really, really interesting toilets that themselves have become placemakers and have become places that, you know, oh, we'll go there, but we've got to see the toilets as well. They actually become part of the tourist trail and everything. And that's something that I think London could really capitalise on, and a lot of small towns as well.
Becoming the toilet capital of the UK.
Of course.
That should be the aim.
Of course.
So the 2 of you make up the Public Toilet Research Unit, is that correct?
Yes.
How does that work within the Helen Hamlyn Centre? Because there's lots of other researchers working on different topics. Are you working with each other on that, or is it quite independent? How does it work on a day-to-day?
No, we all work together when we can. So the Public Toilet Research Unit is a neat way of pulling together all of the work that Jo-Anne and I have done and other researchers that work on our projects have done around public toilets. But we also work within the Inclusive Design for Social Impact space. So we'll, as you mentioned in the intro, we'll have projects working with communities and citizens around different social challenges. So in the past, there's been projects around childhood obesity, for example, around a housing estate in South London. So in the Public Toilets Research Unit, our last project was called Engaged, and that was funded by the Mayor of London on a programme called Designing London's Recovery, so looking at ways to innovate in London post-pandemic. And that looked at the idea that maybe empty shops could be used as part public toilet, part business. So something between the standalone public toilet and asking shops to let non-customers use their toilet. Maybe councils could have a role in bringing more toilets to the high street in this sort of protected space, because there'd be a business there as well within the retail unit, and they could have more say around what that toilet design would be. So make sure that it is an inclusive toilet and make sure it's meeting unmet needs within that community. So that was a really interesting project. And we had other researchers within the Helen Hamlyn Centre who had worked on in many different areas of the Helen Hamlyn Centre, could then come onto that project and learn all about toilets, which they were really, really excited to do.
Yeah.
Whenever we work with anybody, they're like, this is amazing. So much that we can talk about. So that project was really interesting to just learn more about the barriers from council sides, so how to get things happening. We talked to a lot of regeneration officers who said that they bring in the money and the ideas into the council, but then it gets moved on to all the sort of practical elements of of planning and design and developers and finance. So whilst the community at the start of a regeneration project will almost always say that they need toilets within their local community, and it's something that they can very easily get the community excited about, it can often get forgotten about on what can be like a 5 to 10 year process. So one way that we could make a difference is finding ways within councils to keep toilets on the agenda, figuring out how to have someone responsible within the council for toilets, getting the councils to have toilet strategies, which is something which is the law in Wales. The Public Health Act in Wales said that all councils have to have a toilet strategy, but it's not something that's happened in the UK. So we could do more research around the benefits of those and if there's a way to promote them within the UK. So it's interesting how kind of specific an idea can get, but that is where we can make the most difference in a way, not with the big ideas, but with the figuring out where the barriers are and mechanisms for getting around them. So yeah, within the centre, we try to get as many people involved in toilets as possible.
And do you find that externally you have people that come to kind of get consultation from you as the experts in toilets?
Yeah. I mean, we also do have our own sort of RCA spin-out business, Public Convenience Limited. I mean, it really is all Gail and I talk about. We do offer some sort of consultation through that, and we have done some work on that with local authorities and London sort of organisations. But they also come to the Helen Hamlyn Centre every now and again, sometimes with some ideas that we then have to slowly let them down by saying, well, it's not really inclusive, or it's thinking about that and thinking about that. You know, some people have some great ideas about toilets and how it will work well for grandma, and it should be like on in the market. And we can say, well, you know, unfortunately, that's really not going to work for the market sort of thing.
That's the great thing about inclusive design, like both for businesses and for the students, is that it can feel quite laborious trying to involve people in a process when you just want to get on with your design, but it's always so rewarding to hear people's first-hand experiences, hear that diversity of experiences, but also where they're having the same struggles, and you as a designer can think, hang on, I can do something about this and I can really make a difference in people's lives. And also just to challenge your own assumptions that you think you have all the answers, and then it turns out you've never looked at it from that perspective before.
Yeah.
Like things like colour contrast I'd never thought about before coming to the Helen Hamlyn Centre and thinking, oh, actually people with visual impairments would see a toilet much better if you just had the tiles on the wall a different colour to all of the fixtures and fittings. Like, why is everything white and reflective?
Right.
You think it looks clean, but it's actually just quite kind of overwhelming for a lot of people to interpret that space. So, big fan of inclusive design, strangely.
And the other thing as well is that sometimes you can be talking to a very, very diverse group of people that you think, you know, initially then there's no sort of parallel, there's no common ground between them. And yet you talk to them and you suddenly find out that this group over here who have these specific needs and this group over here have these specific needs actually have this one singular need. And in many ways, that's how the Great British Public Toilet Map was born. You know, it came from the fact that, you know, lots and lots of people of very, very differing needs had this one singular need, which was a lack of information about where toilets were. And so that's how it happened.
Yeah, if you can provide the information, then they can determine whether or not it's a toilet that meets their specific needs, but at least they know it exists.
Yeah.
And they're the best person to determine if it will suit them.
Now, designers love challenges. So talking to people who have a range of very different needs, which at the beginning might seem, oh, my goodness, we're never going to see the wood for the trees, will actually show that there is probably a common theme that fits for them, but also actually fits for the rest of us as well.
Well, what's it, disability gain, I believe it's called, right? Isn't it when... I remember someone telling me about that. It's like when there are subtitles on something, right? That they're there for someone who can't hear, but actually they're really useful for, for people that are able to hear.
I mean, having that different colour contrast in the toilets at the museum where we were working, giving some consultation advice, like that just makes a much nicer environment for everyone, because then you've introduced colour into the environment.
Yeah.
And there's lots of other ways that we recommend making a toilet more inclusive, such as having larger taps or locks or flushes that can be used by people with arthritis. So if you could use it with your elbow or closed fist, then you know that it doesn't need a high level of strength or dexterity to use it. But then when I go with my 6-year-old, she can also unlock the toilet as well.
Right.
And so it's just kind of seeing things from other perspectives to realise that actually that's just a better toilet that's just a better design for everyone.
Yeah. I'm afraid I could talk to you about toilets all day, but I do have to start wrapping things up now. I just wondered if you had any advice for people who wanted to engage with kind of like broadly accessible design, or even more specifically toilets.
I suppose the first thing, is to contact Gail and I at the Helen and Hamlyn Centre, specifically about toilets. If you have a more general inclusive design, maybe you're thinking about healthcare or architecture, business. We have researchers working in those areas. So just contact the Helen and Hamlyn Centre and there'll be someone there who will be willing to take you through your first steps and talk to you more about it. So, yeah, that's it. Just another plug. You can also, if you're hesitating to contact us, you can wait for the release of our book, due to be released next year. It's called Designing Inclusive Public Toilets, with the subtitle We the People.
No. Is that WEE?
It is WEE.
Okay, just checking.
And it won't quite be a manifesto, but it will be available from Bloomsbury in 2024, fingers crossed.
Exciting. What about you, Gail? Anything that you would recommend?
Well, for inclusive design in general, the Helen and Hamlyn Centre run a series called Design.Different of webinars. So every couple of months, there's a new webinar that anybody can sign up to. It's free. I think it's also recorded, so you can catch up later. And each one is on a specific aspect of inclusive design, healthcare, social design, built environment. We've probably done about 15 already. So.
Amazing. You've been listening to the Royal College of Art podcast, home to the next generation of artists, innovators and entrepreneurs, and the world's #1 art and design university. You can learn more about our programmes at rca.ac.uk, as well as finding news and events relating to the college and our application portal if you're a prospective student.